there. How are you getting on? Very nice to meet you. How are you doing? I hope you enjoyed them. Good to see you again. Thanks for being here. Good to see you. Good to see you. Thank you very much. Good to see you. Very good. How are you? Good to see you. And your dad. Very good. Very good. Thanks for talking to you. Thanks very much. Good to see you. Nice to meet you. Thank you very much. Good to see you. Thanks for coming. I hope you find it useful. Great to see you. Good to see you. Thanks very much. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Mary Jo Bain. I'm the academic dean here at the Harvard Kennedy School. It is my very great pleasure to welcome you to the 2010 Malcolm Wiener Lecture in International Political Economy, delivered by the Right Honourable Gordon Brown. Mr. Brown, it's an honor to have you back at the Kennedy School. We're so proud to have you and look forward to hearing from you. Before I further introduce our very special guest, I'd like to acknowledge those who have made this evening possible. First, I would like to thank and welcome Malcolm Wiener and his family. Malcolm Wiener, a graduate of Harvard College and the Harvard Law School, spent part of a term here at the Kennedy School 25 years ago working on the study of the Cuban Missile Crisis. While he was here, he was persuaded to help consolidate various activities and raise funds for what is now known as the Wiener Center for Social Policy. He further concluded that while the Kennedy School was preeminent in the areas of national security, health, and poverty, international economic issues were then rather neglected. Hence, the Wiener Lectureship on the International Economy. Malcolm Wiener has published on a wide variety of subjects, including antitrust policy, reform of the international monetary system, the history of modernization in Japan and Turkey, and the role of non-lethal technologies, including electronic communications and cyber warfare, in future conflicts. For the past 23 years, his primary focus has been the study of the rise, florescence, and collapse of the Bronze Age civilizations of Egypt, the Near East, Anatolia, and the Aegean world. We are deeply grateful to Malcolm and his family for their longtime support of the Harvard Kennedy School that makes discussions with distinguished speakers like Gordon Brown possible. I also want to thank the Institute of Politics, where Mr. Brown has been serving as the Heffernan Visiting Fellow this week, and recognize its acting director, Senator John Culver. Before we get started with the speech, I'd like to say a few words about freedom of speech here in the forum. The John F. Kennedy Forum is one of the country's premier venues for public discourse and debate. For almost 30 years, presidents and prime ministers, scientists and generals, candidates and ambassadors, artists and academics have delivered addresses in this forum. We agree to host these leaders with one non-negotiable requirement. They must agree to take unfiltered questions from the audience. The other issue that we are passionate about here in the forum is the principle of civil discourse, which is essential to the life of this university and the future of our democracy. So in return for our speakers' willingness to take questions, we agree to ask questions respectfully and civilly. I'm sure you will respect that commitment. I'd also like to mention that as in all forum events, the press is represented here this evening. Though press members are not allowed to ask questions, audience members should be aware that their words may be publicized. Now, let me tell you a little bit about our speaker. Gordon Brown is a native of Glasgow, which is the birthplace of Adam Smith, which I think is interesting. He has had a distinguished career as a public servant, working at many different levels of government. He grew up in the town of Kirkcaldy, where his father was a Church of England minister, and his mother, an active military volunteer who served as a code breaker during World War II. Mr. Brown's concern for the poor and the disadvantaged was evident early, as he and his brother started a candy store in their parents' garage to raise money for Oxfam. A sports-related eye injury in his formative years, in which the National Health Service saved his sight, was also critical to forming his political beliefs. He began Edinburgh University at 16, where he was the youngest first-year student since World War II. He then became the youngest ever rector of Edinburgh University, meaning that he chaired the university's governing body and also acted as the main university ombudsperson, which certainly is good preparation for a career in politics. Mr. Brown was elected a member of Parliament from Dunfermline East in 1983. He was Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer from July 1992 to May 1997, acting as the Labour Party's spokesperson on economic issues. When Labour won control of the government in 1997, Mr. Brown became Chancellor of the Exchequer. As Chancellor, he presided over Great Britain's longest ever period of sustained growth. He also implemented several major new programs, including the minimum wage, the Child Trust Fund, the Child Tax Credit, and paternity leave. At the G8 Summit in Gleneagles, Scotland in 2005, he led efforts to support the world's poorest countries and tackle climate change. His passion for global justice was reflected in his negotiation of debt cancellation for the world's poorest nations and the tripling of the UK's development budget. Mr. Brown became Prime Minister and leader of the Labour Party in June 2007. Some of his notable accomplishments as Prime Minister include the introduction of neighborhood policing in every area, a legally enforceable right to early cancer screening and treatment, and an innovative Climate Change Act. In April 2009, he hosted the G20 Summit in London, where world leaders committed to make an additional $1.1 trillion available to help the world economy by restoring credit, growth, and jobs. Mr. Brown also ended UK combat operations in Iraq, withdrawing British forces in April 2009. After the December 2009 UN Climate Change Summit in Copenhagen, he agreed to lead an international campaign to turn the agreements reached there into a legally binding treaty. Mr. Brown also worked with his Irish counterpart, Brian Cohen, to negotiate the devolution of policing and justice powers in Northern Ireland. An agreement was finally reached in February 2010, and the powers were passed to Northern Ireland's government in April. After leaving office, Mr. Brown has remained a member of Parliament for Kirkcaldy and Cowdenbeath. Along with his wife, Sarah, he founded Piggy Bank Kids, a nonprofit organization that supports charitable projects to create opportunities for children and young people in the UK. Piggy Bank Kids administers the Jennifer Brown Research Fund, which seeks solutions to pregnancy difficulties and works to save newborn lives. The fund was established in memory of Sarah and Gordon's first child, born in 2001. Mr. Brown is also on the board of the World Wide Web Foundation. We are very, very honored that he is here with us tonight. So now, the Right Honourable Gordon Brown.
Thank you very much. That was very kind. Thank you very much. Can I say, first of all, what a real privilege it is to be in Harvard. To be here at a university which is one of the greatest international universities of the world, with a huge commitment to public service, which is second to none. And in a university where I know from my own experience of talking to students and staff this week, students leave this university not just as citizens of their own country, but as genuine citizens of the world. And I'm grateful to have the chance to be here, thanks to the invitation, first of all, of Vicky Kennedy, the wife of the late Senator Edward Kennedy, who was a great friend of mine, and Senator Calvert, who's here this evening, was also one of Ted Kennedy's great friends. And Ted Kennedy taught me a huge amount in politics. He had joined the Senate very early in 1960, at the very young age of 30. And he told me he'd put on his election literature when he stood in Massachusetts that this state needs a senator of youth and fresh ideas. Now, I was in Parliament for many years as well, and I was thinking of what I would say when I got to my election. And he told me what he said at his second last election in Massachusetts. He changed his poster and he said, this state needs a senator of maturity and experience. I was once a university lecturer, and I know that universities like Harvard stand for objectivity and for rationality, and for the pursuit of truth and knowledge and objectivity. And these are all the qualities you have to leave behind when you go into politics. You know, in number 10 and number 11 Downing Street in London, where I stayed for many years, as you go in these great black doors, behind them in number 11 are two huge portraits. And one is of the Prime Minister Gladstone, who was Prime Minister in 4 separate administrations in the 19th century. And the second, looking at him and glowering at him, is Disraeli, who was a Prime Minister who succeeded Gladstone, and then Gladstone beat him in a future election. And these two men are looking at each other as you walk into Downing Street, and these faces you see as you go in. And it's said when Gladstone spoke to you and gave a speech and you listened to him, you went away thinking he was the wisest person in the world. But it was said of Disraeli that when he spoke, such was his charm, that you went away thinking you were the wisest person in the world. And it's my intention this evening that you feel that what I say is of some use in the future debates we're going to have in this country and around the world. We are in a very new age. You know, when Disraeli was Prime Minister in Britain, he could spend much of his days writing poetry. And the fact that nobody liked his poetry didn't seem to matter to him at all. And when Gladstone was Prime Minister, he formed what was called the Midnight Club for Fallen Women. And I don't know what the press would make of this, but he went out into the streets of London trying to recruit prostitutes and turn them from their ways into decent, as he saw it, law-abiding citizens. I think some of our newspapers would have a great deal of fun for some time with that. And then we had Rosebery, who was Prime Minister in our country, and he was a man who, if a racehorse meeting, a horse racing meeting, clashed with a cabinet meeting, he would always go to the horse racing meeting. And when he was asked what was his greatest achievement in life, it wasn't being Prime Minister or anything else, it was his horse winning the Grand National race. And that was the 19th century. And when we came to the 20th century and to the crisis of 1929, which hit the whole world, the financial crisis, I think our political systems were totally unprepared for these great events. We were amateurs in a world of huge problems and huge challenges that had to be met. And you know, in 1929, the great economist Keynes wrote a book called How We Can Conquer Unemployment. And that book set out how you could take action, such as we've been looking at now, to deal with an economic crisis that seemed beyond your control, but was putting millions of people out of work. And when I arrived in the Treasury in 1997, I asked to see this document, which was in the Treasury Library. And Keynes had written this great document, How We Can Conquer Unemployment. And it was very interesting that the head of the Treasury of that time had written only 3 words on this document. And the 3 words were inflation, extravagance, bankruptcy. And so the ideas of the greatest economist of the 20th century were simply thrown away. And Churchill thought of the response, and Winston Churchill, of course, is one of our great heroes and was a great Prime Minister. You know, he made a resolution early on in life that he would not drink before lunchtime. And then he changed it later. He made the resolution he would not drink before breakfast. And Churchill said of the 1930s, he said, we were resolved to be irresolute. We were adamant for drift. We were solid for fluidity. And we were all-powerful for impotence. And I want to suggest that now that we are in a totally new world, and I want to describe it, that we need new policies and new institutions and a new way of doing things to deal with what is a fundamental shift in the way that the world works. And I want to suggest to you that we are not dealing simply with the global financial crisis that arrived in 2007 and is going away in 2010. What we're dealing with is not even an economic crisis similar to the 1930s in many respects. We're dealing with what I would call the first crisis of the global age. And we're dealing with problems that are so global in the nature that global problems cannot be solved by simply national solutions. If you've got global problems, then you need global solutions. if you look at the policies of the 19th and 20th century that American governments, British governments, and other governments followed, then it was obviously the right thing. You would have a national policy for tackling inflation. You would have a national policy for building infrastructure. You'd have a national or state policy, local autonomy for delivering education. And you would consider what you did as a nation to be competitive, to be successful, and to deliver the best prosperity for your people. But look at the problems we face in 2010. Climate change, if you agree with the evidence, climate change cannot be solved by one country alone. It cannot even be solved in one continent alone. It can only be solved by global coordinated action. And equally, terrorism and security affects every continent and not just one. And while one country leads in dealing with the action on terrorism, it needs other countries to take action themselves. And so we have a global problem that needs global coordinated action. And when you come to the financial and economic issues of our time, and I'm very pleased to be giving this lecture, the Wiener lecture, because of Mr. Wiener's great interest in international economic policy, and I'm privileged to be in his company and that of his family. But if you look at the problems that we face now, these are global problems that can only be dealt with by globally coordinated solutions. Now, what is actually happening around the world? We've had a financial crisis. We've lost 30 million jobs. There are now 200 million people around the world unemployed. We've lost a massive amount of trade that may not easily be recovered. But what has actually happened is more fundamental than that. For 200 years, Europe and America together produced most of the world's goods. For 200 years of industrialization, indeed all the period of industrialization, between us, America and Europe was responsible for the majority of manufacturing products in the world. For 200 years, we were responsible also for the majority of trade in the world. It was trade that was initiated by Europe and by America. For 200 years during this industrial era, we were also responsible for the majority of investment in the world. And of course, as a result of that, we were responsible and we were the consumers of the majority of goods and services in the world. But what has happened in this decade is quite fundamental. For the first time since the Industrial Revolution, we are no longer the majority producer in the world, the two of our continents, nor the majority manufacturer, nor the majority trader in the world. We have a minority of production, we have a minority of trade, and we have a minority of manufacturing share of goods in the world. And perhaps more worrying, we are not the majority investor in the world either. So the majority of investment is not being made in Europe and America. It is now being made by the rest of the world, and of course, particularly in Asia. And what is the lesson that I learned from that? Because it's absolutely fundamental to how we solve the problems of the future. That no longer can we make decisions about growth that don't take into account the Asian consumer, the investor in Asia, the investor in other parts of the world, and the demand that can be created in these parts of the world. And what I look forward to in the next few years is a situation where instead of the Asian being simply the producer of the world's goods, they become consumers of world goods that we can export from America and from Europe to a population that is far bigger than Europe and America combined. And you see, if we simply think that each of us can export our way out of the present current economic problems, and every country thinks they can export, then it cannot happen because someone has to import goods. And we have to get to a situation in this world economy where the consumers of goods are increasingly not just us, America and Europe, but consumers in China and India and in the rest of Asia. 1 billion people will join the middle class over the next few years in these countries. And we've got to think of a world trading system that allows us to be exporters and manufacturers and in the high value-added products, delivering these goods for sale not just to Europe and America, but to the rest of the world. And I think this is a fundamental lesson that we've learned from the world economic crisis, that we've got to coordinate economic policy if we're going to make sure that everybody here in America, here in Europe, and around the world has the best chance of prosperity. There are choices that have to be made. My friend John Kenneth Galbraith was a great professor here at Harvard, as everybody knows. And many of us were very much influenced by the work that he wrote. And he told me that in 1985, he went to the Austrian Republic to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the Austrian Republic that had been created in 1945. And he was invited to be the lead speaker in this great gathering. And in the front row, as he was speaking, was von Hayek, the great neoliberal economist, Mises, and other of that Austrian school of economics. And John Kenneth Galbraith made this joke to them. He said that he wanted to thank von Hayek and the others for what they had contributed to the success of the Austrian economy since 1945. He said that if they hadn't left the country then Austria could never have enjoyed the growth and prosperity and jobs that it had. And there is a debate about economic policy to be had about whether it's the deficit or whether it's growth or whether it's employment that is your first focus. But let me tell you, the IMF has just done a study which shows that if the world could coordinate its policy, and that is that we could have an arrangement whereby we could increase investment in Europe and America, while at the same time dealing with deficit reduction, and at the same time we could increase consumption in China and Asia to the point at which they are consumers of the world's goods, then we could create 30 million more jobs. We could take 50 to 100 million people out of poverty. We could see a 4% growth in the world economy by 2014, and at the same time, we could see $3 trillion of extra economic activity in the world. So my first message to you is that global problems, and these are clearly global problems, need global solutions. My second and final message to you this evening is about the financial crisis itself. When I came to Harvard in 1998 and spoke at this rostrum, and genuinely I was speaking at the rostrum this time rather than what I'm doing today, I talked about the global financial system. And I said that we would be persistently at the mercy of crises if we didn't create for a global financial system where there are global flows of capital, global financial supervision, and not simply national financial supervision. And I suggested that we have an early warning system for the world economy where if there were financial irregularities and risks and instabilities that were developing, we could easily take the action that was necessary. And I was unsuccessful in persuading my fellow colleagues that we needed to take that action as a result of the Asian crisis. Now we have found something bigger, I think, about the working of financial institutions that we have got to deal with. I think people would be surprised if they thought that the subprime crisis that started in America, $1.5 trillion of mortgages that had to be written off, that half these mortgages were actually sold to Europe and landed up in European banks where they had no idea what the value of these products were. And what we had was a financial system that was taking risks, but a financial system that didn't have sufficient capital to underpin the risks that had been taken. And I think the lesson that we learned is that none of the theories that we had before 2007 stood up to examination. The neoliberal theory about how markets work cannot explain why markets did not self-adjust, but markets actually self-destructed. And they could not explain why the financial institutions themselves did not recover but froze in the activities that were taking place across the financial system. And what is called the third way, our own view about how economic policy could develop over the last 10, 12 years, which was a reconciliation of markets and state, and rightfully so, markets and states, markets and governments working together for a common purpose with public-private partnerships. We had not understood that behind the operation of markets, there lay the irresponsibility that we saw in the banking system that was not able to be controlled. And it comes down to this simple issue, that markets need morals, that markets operate in a society and an environment where the values do not come from the markets themselves, but come from us, the people. And that the values that we want to see, fairness and responsibility as well as enterprise competition, are values that we have to bring to the marketplace. And that's why we need a global financial constitution that deals with the issues of fairness and responsibility as well as enterprise competition and risk, and make sure that we can never get into a situation again where the relationship between markets and government is such that we have not taken the prior action that is necessary to avoid abuse in the financial system. Now, I've got two big proposals then. First is that we need global coordination of economic policy. And I agree that is difficult for countries to accept because national economic policies are so important and the sovereignty of these national economic policies is widely respected and upheld. And I've got a second proposal, therefore, that we need a global financial system and probably a constitution for the global financial institutions that sets down the rules and standards that are agreed not just in one country, but right across the board. And I believe America has a very important role always in leading the way forward. You are the most successful economic power of the century. You have the most innovative technologies and entrepreneurs that the world has ever seen. You were the first to recognize after the Second World War that we needed a Marshall Plan so that Europe could be reconstructed and world trade could be resumed. And it was George Marshall here in Harvard who put forward that proposal. You were the first also to realize that we had to build new international institutions, the IMF and the World Bank, for this global era. And I think American leadership in creating the global growth plan that I know President Obama has been committed to would make a huge difference to the potential for jobs and for growth and for prosperity in America and in the rest of the world. Now, people may say that to create this global growth pact and to create a global financial constitution is to dream something that is impossible. You know, during my lifetime, things that I thought impossible have actually happened. I could not have imagined that Nelson Mandela would go free from prison and apartheid would be ended in the early 1990s. Despite all the campaigns that we had, we never thought that that would happen so as it did. And we never thought that the Cold War would be brought to a sudden end in 1990 with the fall of the Berlin Wall, the reunification of Germany, the unification of Europe, and now 27 nations part of a European Union which is committed to peace, democracy, and the liberty of the individual. And I think it's possible to imagine in this century dealing with the problems of climate change, but dealing also with the problems of financial instability, of poverty and inequality around the world, and dealing with the problems of terrorism and insecurity, that we can fashion a global cooperation that is far stronger and far deeper than everything we've had before. I was a student at Edinburgh University. And when you are students, this is the time when the decisions you make and the things you do can influence the rest of your life, and in particular influence the public service you as individuals can do. And I was very fortunate that I started with my brother encouraging me to form a charity that helped Oxfam and dealt with hunger in Africa, and then to become the Chancellor of the Exchequer in a British government that gave billions of pounds with other countries in debt relief and in help to the poorest countries in the world. And I feel very fortunate to have started myself in a constituency which was riddled with unemployment as a result of the loss of mining jobs and the constituency I represent now. And to see over these last 13 years that we created 2 million jobs as a government on the road that we want to achieve, which is full employment in our country. So I feel fortunate that things that I did when I was a student and when I was young have yielded results that I was able to play a part in working with other colleagues and other people in our community to achieve. And I think if you as students think of what you doing now, your commitment to public service, can achieve in the future, then things that might seem impossible as they did in the 1970s and 1980s can actually be the things that happen. You know, in one of the Greek writers once said, "When will there be justice in Athens?" he said. And the answer that he gave was, when those who do not suffer are as angry as those who do. And that is an injunction to all of us who are privileged and have great opportunities to help other people. My suggestion to this great gathering today is they work together to bind the nations of the world closer in a plan that will make possible a real recovery from this recession and create millions of jobs. It is not an impossible dream. It is entirely achievable. Working together with American leading, we can do it. Thank you very much.
It is now time for questions, and we have time for questions. There are 4 microphones, 2 on this level and 2 up on the second level. If you would like to ask a question, please go to one of the microphones, and I will take questions in order, starting here and going around. Let me remind you all of the rules for asking questions here in the forum. The first rule is that we ask that you identify yourself when you ask a question, your name and where you are from. Secondly, you are to ask one question and to keep it brief and succinct. And the third rule is that your question end with a question mark. So with those rules, we will proceed. We'll start over here. Please ask your question, and then as you...
Hello, Mr. Prime Minister. Thanks for speaking with us this evening. My name is Rich Mayapolsky. I'm a sophomore at the college. And my question is to you, what types of articles or statutes would you see in this global constitution? I'm just curious to hear some types of specifics that you would be interested in.
Great. Thank you very much for that question. It allows me to explain why I think it's really important that we not only have national supervision of financial institutions, we have global financial supervision. You see, we had a debate at the G20. We had the G20 in London in April 2009, and we had all the 20 leaders of the world meeting there and sitting to discuss all the big issues. And one of the big issues, surprisingly, that divided people and was absolutely controversial was the issue of tax havens. And the French were very determined that we make a commitment that there be exchange of information between different tax authorities so that we could eliminate the race to the bottom that is involved if you have tax havens that take away trade from one center and put pressure on it to change its rules in a way that lowers standards. And so if you don't have a global agreement, then increasingly you will have areas of the world that will offer themselves as regulatory havens or tax havens, and they will escape the supervision that is necessary to have a global financial order. What would be in the global financial constitution is this. First of all, you need to be absolutely sure that your financial institutions operate in a way that is transparent. Secondly, you need to be absolutely sure that they have sufficient capital for the risks that they are taking. Thirdly, you need to be absolutely sure that they have the liquidity that is necessary for them to be continuing bodies. And fourthly, you need cooperation amongst the different supervisors and regulators of the world so that where companies cross borders, we know exactly what is happening instead of only what is happening in one area of the world. So there is general support now for action to be taken. The problem is, as after the Asian crisis, people begin to forget and then they leave the issues on the table without resolving the conclusions. I believe that if we could move quickly on these issues, we can put in place measures that would actually give people an insurance that you could not have the same sort of crisis again. So that's what I mean by a global financial constitution.
Mr. Brown, my name is Ned Tebbets. I'm a graduate of the Kennedy School. And my question has to do with, for the United States in the last 10 years, we've had a cumulative excess of imports over exports of roughly $6 trillion. What actions do you suggest might be appropriate for the United States to deal with that very serious trade deficit?
This goes to the heart of what I'm saying, and I think it's a really important question, because the obvious temptation, if you have a flood of imports into your country, is to try to take action to reduce the amount of imports. And the obvious temptation is to say, let us have a trade barrier, or let us protect ourselves against what is often classified as unfair competition from countries that pay very low wages. But the problem is that if you start to put protectionist measures in, you actually mean that trade will be disrupted, and even your own exports will not be able to get to the countries you want. And what I'm suggesting to you is that perhaps it is better to look at it another way, that Chinese, Indian, Asian countries want to become consumers themselves. They want the prosperity that has eluded them in the last century to be there for them to enjoy also. And their wishes and their desires are not too different from the American and European consumer to buy homes and to have the modern goods and the modern equipment and electronics that is necessary and felt to be important to your standard of living. And why can't we see a situation where we, with our expertise in the high technology, custom-built, value-added goods, are in a position to sell into the Chinese, the Indian, and the Asian market, as well as into the markets of developing countries and emerging markets. And these are billions of potential consumers where American brand names are the only names that matter in some parts of the world, and where American and European products and European services are quite unique and far higher quality than can be produced elsewhere. So my answer to you is, in a situation where the American consumer and the Asian consumer want similar things, why can't we put ourselves in a position where we are exporting more to these countries as consumption develops in these countries, and that is a better way of securing the wealth and the prosperity of workers in America. If we do it the other way, we're engaged in another race to the bottom, because Chinese wages are $400 a month. But then Thai wages, Thailand's wages are $300 a month. And then Philippine wages and Indonesian wages are $200 a month. And then you get to Vietnam wages, which are $100 a month. And we could be engaged in low-wage competition for the rest of our lives. Far better to prepare ourselves and equip ourselves for the consumer markets of the future, where we also can be exporting to countries around the world. So my argument is not protectionism, because that will not, in the end, protect people's jobs. My argument is to increase trade and to make sure that our products, by pushing the Chinese and other governments, can get into these markets. And that is the way that the world will start to recover and jobs will be created.
My name is Daniel Norris. I'm a junior at the college. The recent debt troubles in Greece, I think, illustrate some of the problems that can arise with increased international economic coordination. How would you deal with some sort of problems that might arise with increased global coordination, as you're speaking of?
Well, I think Greece's problems, let's be honest, and the Prime Minister will tell you that, arise from decisions made in Greece by the Greeks, which were not in the interest of the Greek people. And they arise from an unwillingness over a decade to tell the truth about what the true fiscal position in Greece was. And if you have a situation where, as I understand it, they published the public finance figures and didn't include the defense budget, then you're bound not to have the true picture of what has actually happened. So Greece's problems started in Greece and are actually Greek problems that need to be solved by them sorting out the deficit. But I would say this, that the only way of sorting out the problems of a low-growth economy are to ensure that you can grow faster. And if you ask me, what is the real problem we face? Now, some of you will be graduates in the next year, and you'll be going out to look for jobs. And I know that Harvard graduates will do very well in the labor market. But we know in Britain, as you know here, that there are many graduates who are looking for jobs that cannot get them at the moment. And there are many people wanting to go to college and university, and the number of places is insufficient for the numbers who want to go. And we know, therefore, that the problem that people are asking about is, where are the jobs going to come from? Where is the growth going to come in this international economy for America, for Europe, and for other parts of the world? And the real problem is that we face a low-growth decade where growth will be low, unemployment will be high over the next 10 years unless we take action. And it seems to me there are only two courses of action. One is you can take a protectionist course, and you can look in on yourself and try to protect yourself against imports and what's going to happen in the rest of the world. Or the second way is the way I'm proposing, is that we look to cooperate with other countries and coordinate our economic policy in such a way that there is mutual benefit to everyone. And when you add up what people want to do around the world, China says that it wants to take millions of people out of poverty. Well, let them prove it by increasing consumption in China and buying exports from us and from other parts of the world. Europe wants to reduce unemployment, wants to do economic reform to make that possible. but that is totally consistent with a policy that will increase growth during the course of the next few years. And of course, America wants to export, and that is a right course of action, but let's make it possible for the trade in the world to be sufficient in a growing economy for American jobs to be expanded and not to be cut back.
Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister, for taking the time out of your busy schedule to visit us at Harvard and deliver the Malcolm Wiener Lecture in Political Economy. I'm John Soylu from Turkey. I'm a freshman at the college. I had a question about the global problems that needed global cooperation you mentioned in your speech. What role should the UN play in this global cooperation you're mentioning, and where do you see the UN in that picture?
I was at Copenhagen at the climate change conference. It was a fascinating occasion because you had 190 countries, all members of the United Nations, in one room trying to make a collective decision. And it turned out to be quite difficult. In fact, as we started the proceedings, one delegate from one country proposed that the Prime Minister of Denmark, who was about to chair the proceedings, should not be allowed to take the chair. And there were debates about whether the person who had actually convened the conference with the support of the United Nations should actually be chairing the conference that he had organized. And it was an unwieldy way of not making good decisions. So eventually it became, you know the minister who said, past policies have led us to the edge of the abyss, and now is the time for a bold step forward. And I think that really was what was happening at Copenhagen, that we were not in a good position as we arrived because we hadn't the degree of agreement before we got there, and we were in a worse position because we didn't have a mechanism of making decisions. So if the United Nations is going to solve the problem with countries working together on climate change, you've got to find a better way of making the decisions. As far as economic policy is concerned, the G20 is now the premier forum for economic coordination. And that means all the major economies of the world and Africa and representatives from the different continents meet together to make critical decisions. My plea is that having already had decisions that prevented a global depression as a result of the activities of a number of countries in the G20, and having begun to rescue the banking system, we don't stop there. We go further and make sure that we satisfy ourselves that enough is in place for there to be global growth. Now, I don't think that can happen through 190 countries meeting in one room trying to make a decision, but I think it can happen through the G20, which has been created, which I think is probably the best organ for getting the world economy moving again.
Go over here.
Hello, Mr. Brown. My name is Violet Gonda. I'm a student here at Harvard. I have a specific question about the situation. I would like to get your thoughts on the situation in Zimbabwe, where I come from. Your predecessor, Mr. Tony Blair, reportedly said in his memoirs that he regrets not having toppled Robert Mugabe. Do you share the same regrets? And also, President Robert Mugabe is refusing to implement the power sharing agreement in Zimbabwe until the sanctions that have been imposed by Britain, America, and other Western countries have been removed. What are your thoughts on this? And do you think it's time that, for the sake of progress, that the sanctions are removed?
It is a tragedy, and I think people who look at Zimbabwe, and I know you come from Zimbabwe, but people look at Zimbabwe, see this tragedy of a country that is potentially the richest country and most prosperous country in Africa, is laid low by massive unemployment, by huge disputes over farmland and the, if you like, the grain basket of that part of Africa not able to produce the farm goods it needs. And then you saw last year, tragically, that people were suffering from cholera as a result of the failure of healthcare and sanitation policies in that country. Now, the question is what you can do about something that is completely abhorrent to us, that someone who has not a democratic mandate, who did not win the election, who entered into a power-sharing agreement, has got to live up to the promises that were made at that time, but is not yet doing so. But you see, the issue in Africa is not whether Britain or America can take unilateral action in relation to the Zimbabwean regime. The issue is what the countries surrounding Zimbabwe, who are friends of the Zimbabwean people, South Africa, which has millions now of Zimbabwean refugees in South Africa, what they can do in coordination to persuade Zimbabwe to change its ways. We have actually said that we are going to be happy to be flexible about the sanctions issue. But the question, I think, is whether Africa as itself can agree a policy that will ensure that we have a transition to a government that will command majority power after an election that would take place in the future in Zimbabwe. So it's not an easy answer to say that, that Britain or America could take direct action here, but it is, I think, an answer to say that the whole of the African community can persuade the Zimbabwean people that its interest in Zimbabwe is such for the future that we've got to see an end to practices that are equivalent to those of a dictatorship and not a democracy.
Mr. Brown, it's an absolute pleasure to have you with us tonight. My name is Arturo. I am a sophomore here at Harvard College, concentrating in environmental sciences and public policy. Now, the United Kingdom has been a key player in the world's commitment to the Green Revolution. It has managed to reduce its pollution in its largest city, London, by a stunning 12% since the early 1990s. However, it has become increasingly dependent on oil, and oil that not always comes in from the North Sea. How does this speak on the behalf of the development of the world? And speaking in terms of a global problem, what is a viable global solution?
Thank you very much. We are now the biggest, Britain is the biggest country for the generation of wave power and wind power. And we are creating an industry for renewables that will actually grow and expand and create thousands of jobs in the years to come. But I agree with you that too many countries are too dependent on one source of supply, which is oil, and a balanced energy policy is in the interest of every country, where you have a number of different sources of supply that don't make you dependent on one region of the world or dependent on one resource. You know, I was talking about the climate change conference in Copenhagen. In a way, it didn't prove to me that people can't cooperate. What it proved to me is that we miscalculated what people were prepared to offer. You see, if you look at the conclusions of the climate change conference, it's fascinating to know that we agreed on a target for carbon emissions, 80% for the rich countries by 2050, and a target for all countries. We actually agreed on a system of transparency so that people could know what was happening in individual countries. We agreed that each country would produce a national carbon emission plan. And even more important, in a way, we agreed that we would support financially the adaptation and mitigation measures that were being taken by the poorest countries in the world. So we had the progress on the measures, but what we didn't get agreed was a treaty itself. And we had all expected that countries, having reached these decisions about the four big issues, would be prepared to sign a treaty that bound them into an international framework. And you know, one of the reasons why we don't have the levels of investment in low-carbon technologies and renewables that you want to see and I want to see at the moment is because of uncertainty that has been created because of the lack of a treaty. And the question I ask myself now is, could you get the same results by having a framework agreement that did not require every country to legislate in its own parliament in the manner that a treaty requires them to do? And I think that's the issue that we've now got to discuss. We want to get these individual measures, which are actually the equivalent of a climate change agreement, moving forward, but we need a framework which gives people certainty about the future. You see, it makes my point in a way. This is a global problem. We know that pollution and the effect that the environment has on each of our countries is a global problem that cannot be solved in one continent or one country. But we are reluctant, many of us, to sign up to international agreements that are binding. Perhaps the way forward on this is to have a framework agreement which can be negotiated and successfully administered within the international community, but leaves the responsibility on the individual national governments to deliver. So I think there is a way forward here. And my conclusion from Copenhagen, apart from my talk about the difficulty of reaching decisions in a 190 group of people, but my conclusion is there wasn't a lack of will to come to an agreement, but we miscalculated what each country was prepared to offer in getting to that agreement. And I still think an agreement that will give greater certainty. And you know, this is an industry that could employ thousands of people in the United States of America as well as in Britain. this is an industry that we want to support for the future and make sure that the Chinese, the Indians, and others are prepared to buy low-carbon technologies from us.
Hello, Mr. Brown. I'm Tom Snyder. I'm a sophomore at the college, and I was just wondering, countries like Germany still maintain a lot of their manufacturing, dynamism in their manufacturing and other aspects of their economy, but their populations continue to shrink. And so, based on that, how conceivable do you think it is that they can continue with sustained economic growth under the system that you're talking about while still decreasing in population and facing a lot of those issues as well?
Yeah, Germany's worried. I think people who know Germany's worried because with a rising population of elderly people, then there is a cost to be borne in the provision of pensions and social security. And if you have a smaller working age population, then you don't have the tax revenues that you would have if you had a higher number of people in work. So the reason that Germany is more worried about its fiscal position than other countries is that they are having to make that provision for a future where the bills will be higher because of an elderly population. But you know, Germany is successful in manufacturing. It had 10 years when it barely grew at all as a country, and 10 years where it spent time adjusting to the euro, where real wages fell in Germany for that period of time. So Germany is a highly competitive country as a result of the changes that it has made. But you know, I think sometimes when I come here that people underestimate the manufacturing strength of America. And I think sometimes you should be even more vociferous in telling people the strengths of this country's manufacturing base. The aerospace orders that are coming to America are coming from China and Asia, as I think they're building 100 airports in China at the moment, and just the scale of what is happening means that there are major orders for those people who are leading the world, like the Airbus in Europe and like Boeing in America. It's true, you see, that computers, the workforce in computers in America was, I think, 150,000 when the first big computer was eventually put on the market. And the workforce directly in computers, directly in the manufacturing computers, is very low now. And there are certainly 1 million people employed in making computers in China and Asia. But the wealth from the computer and IT industry is in the design, it's in the software, it's in the creative talents, like in the iPod and in the iPad and in the different computer innovations that are being built. So it's not necessarily true that the production side of manufacturing going on in China or in Asia means that the wealth is not being created in America as well. In fact, the profit from an iPod or from an iPad for the production side is very, very small, $2 or $3 for the producer, and most of the profit lies in the innovation and in the creative talents. And you should be very confident as a country about your innovative talents, your creative talents, your entrepreneurial flair, your business acumen, and many of your manufacturing industries. So I think the capacity of America and parts of Europe to export to the rest of the world is so good for the next in the next period that you've got to create a situation where the rest of the world is ready to buy from America. I suppose it makes my point again that trade is going to be the engine of growth in the future. And it's really important to understand that there is a market of billions of people ready to be taken up.
Mr. Brown, thank you so much for speaking to us tonight. My name is Mary Reed. I'm a freshman at the college. And my question has to do with the fact that you've obviously addressed a great deal the need for coordinated global efforts in dealing with economic crises and with the economy in general, and also about the rise of Asia in terms of global importance. And I'm wondering how you propose dealing with the fact that often the interests of the developed world, the US and the UK, don't coincide with the interests of China and India in terms of environmental policy, human rights, things like that. How would you propose specifically trying to convince China to, say, sign on to environmental legislation through incentives, through economic consequences? Yeah.
You're absolutely right, and this is a very important question. You know that the issue of human rights is always on the agenda when Britain meets China, and I know when America meets China. And it is our duty to point out that There are issues of human rights and executions, and also issues about the detention of particular people that have got to be spelt out in any discussion. And it's our duty on behalf of these people and the duty on behalf of the importance that we attach to human rights in the world to do so. I think, as I said, on environment, we were pretty close to getting some progress on these environmental issues. And China wants to create green cities, and although the record is of increasing pollution as a result of industry and the building of many, many coal power stations almost every week or month, then there is a chance, I think, of getting some agreed standards on environmental pollution. I think this issue about whether to cooperate or not is absolutely essential. You know, when I was chairman of the International Monetary Fund Committee, we had all these meetings in Washington, and we had lots of demonstrators at the time, and these were anti-globalization protesters. And one day, I was telling the students 2 days ago when I met them, one day I went out and I saw this demonstration. There was a banner that said, "Worldwide Campaign Against Globalization." And you sort of know what people thought and what they were trying to say. France had a similar campaign in the anti-globalization campaign in 2007, and the campaign slogan was simply "No to 2008." So there is a nihilism about some of these protests that you can see from the slogans. But you know, it's the most difficult thing in the world for countries like ours to, having made national policy decisions on all the great national issues for the last 200 years, to recognize that the interdependence of the world economy is such that we are not going to prosper with only national solutions to what are global problems. And if I'm right, the global problem is unbalanced and unsustainable and inequitable growth, where the majority of production is now done in one part of the world and the majority of consumption is in another part of the world. Now, some people might say the answer is for this part of the world to cut its consumption, but perhaps the answer is for the rest of the world to be in a position to actually increase its consumption. And people who have worked very hard in China and India and the rest of the world to be in a position to buy the world's goods. And that's where I think the breakthrough in getting to a scenario where there is global growth and global employment can actually happen. And I believe that with goodwill, you see, the Chinese objective in the stated documents is to take millions more people out of poverty. That is what they say the purpose of the government is. Now, you can doubt whether the industrial policy and export policy that is being pursued is not taking money away from the consumer and putting it into the hands of industry and export development. But the truth is, if China were to pursue the policy of taking millions more people out of poverty, then there would have to be increased consumer spending in the Chinese economy. Then consumer spending, which is only 35% of Chinese national income, would be rising, and they would be in a position to buy goods not just from within China, but from the rest of the world. Now, consumer spending is 75%, going to 70% now of the US economy, but it's 35% of the Chinese economy. So as the economies grow, it's possible to imagine China moving from 35 to 40 to 45 to 50, and that is trillions of dollars of economic activity where there are export markets. And it's true of India, it's true of the rest of Asia, it's true of Japan, it's true of many countries which could increase their consumer spending and take exports from this and from other countries. And I think it is in our interest to pursue that policy, which is a mutual benefit to Asia, America, and Europe.
We'll take 2 more questions, so one over here and then one over here.
Okay, all right. Thank you so much for your presentation, Mr. Brown. On a similar note to that question, if the United States and the United Kingdom continue to fall behind China in production and manufacturing without reducing importing, as you had suggested earlier, what do you believe will become of their futures? I'm sorry, by the way, I'm a little bit nervous.
What will become of our futures?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. You see, again, that's right to the heart of the problem that we're dealing with. People are worried about the jobs. People are worried about the standards of living. It's true to say in America, as it is in some parts of Europe, that people's standards of living have not risen for many, many years. And it's true also that one of the consequences of that was that to ensure a higher standard of living or to get a mortgage, people were borrowing heavily on incomes that were not rising fast. Now, the question is, how do you increase your incomes? If you're thinking of the next job that you would do if you're in a job, or you're thinking as a student or a young person of what job you take, it's clear that the value that comes from being in a skilled job is far greater than the value that comes from being in an unskilled or semi-skilled job. And it's clear that the market in the future will favor those companies that can produce high technology goods and custom-built goods and value-added products, not just goods, but also services that can be sold to the rest of the world. And that's where the future lies. But to be able to prepare for that future, you've got to invest in education, you've got to invest in technology, you've got to invest in industry. Now, at the moment, as you know, in America, people don't see that there is sufficient demand for them to justify as businesses making the investment that is necessary for the future. So you've got large numbers of companies hoarding money now and not investing because they cannot see the markets or the capacity there to make the profits in the future. But if we could see world demand rising, and if America is well placed, like Britain and other countries, with the high technology goods and services, then in a few years' time, but even earlier, if we come to a global agreement, the consumer demands of the rest of the world can be met by our products being sold to the rest of the world. And I think it's a powerful argument. You see, I think the American dream that every generation will do better than the last can be renewed by ensuring that people have the skills and the education and the technology to benefit from what is going to be a changing world market in the years to come. You can compete on low pay, but you have to go into a race to the bottom. But you can compete on high skill, and there is no country that's got better. I'm going to stand up for British universities, but there are no countries other than Britain and America that can surpass us in the standard of universities.
This will be the last question.
Do you want to take one or two, and I'll take them in one go, so that everybody has a chance to get their questions? It's up to you.
I think we'll do one more.
Hi there, Mr. Brown. My name is Lincoln Hill. I'm actually a second year reading history and politics at Oxford, so glad you stood up for British universities. And I'm actually also an active member of the Labour Party in Oxford East. So hope to see you at conference next week.
I'll be there on Saturday.
The question.
All right. Figures out today show that Ireland's economy shrank by 1.2% in the second quarter. And of course, their austerity measures were one of those that are most touted by our good friends, Mr. Cameron and Mr. Osborne. So what do you think that the Irish example says about the way that other developed economies should go about reducing their debt burdens?
You've got to ask again, what is the big problem we face? And if you conclude the big problem is deficits, and that's the biggest problem of all, you will reduce deficits and do that at the cost and expense of anything else. But if you think the biggest problem is the lack of growth and the lack of jobs, and therefore the lack of an economy that can produce tax revenues and produce jobs for people who don't have to rely on Social Security and unemployment benefits, then you will concentrate on getting the economy growing again. And that's really the message that I take from what's happening around the world, that there is insufficient evidence that the economy is going to grow fast enough in the advanced industrial economies for us to take risks with the recovery. And I think it's very important to recognize that over the next few months, you will see in some countries unemployment rising rather than falling because the resources in that economy are being cut at a time when there is insufficient investment or other drivers of growth to replace what has been taken out. And it's a big problem because you can either say the exit strategy from this global recession is a whole series of deficit cutting which will eventually somehow lead to a rise in private investment in a few years to come. Or you can look at the evidence and say that private investment is not going to rise unless there is sufficient consumer demand and the prospect of exports for people to think it worthwhile investing. And so you therefore draw the conclusion that if you don't have an exit strategy that is what I'm talking about, expanding world trade and expanding world demand, you will be in a low growth decade with high unemployment for years to come. Now, that's the real question. If the problem is growth and unemployment, and you've got to deal with that first, then it means that you have got to make sure that the resources in your economy are sufficient to avoid unemployment rising.
Well, this has been a wonderfully wide-ranging conversation. I want to thank the audience for some very, very good questions. But please now join me in thanking Gordon Brown for his presentation.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much. We got this one.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks very much. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed it.